Hello, I'm Morris Long, and you're listening to the Video Games Are Bad For You podcast. This week's episode is brought to you by BRAINWAVE, our weekly online newsletter about games and culture. Subscribers to BRAINWAVE receive an email every Monday containing the latest podcasts and articles from our website, along with some great art and design inspired by the latest gaming news. Subscribers also receive a weekly super secret column by me, written exclusively for the newsletter. You can find a link on our website or in the description below. Once again, that's BRAINWAVE, an online newsletter. BRAINWAVE. The games industry is constantly changing. Don't miss a thing. BRAINWAVE. I want to tell you about the greatest Alfred Hitchcock movie that nobody has seen. Even if you're not the biggest cinephile, you've most likely encountered Alfred Hitchcock at some point in your life. His films like Psycho or North by Northwest are legendary, and with good reason. He's probably the greatest filmmaker of his era, if not the greatest filmmaker of all time. But he also has an interminably long filmography. Alfred Hitchcock started making films in the silent film era, and he finished making films in the 70s. Think of that. In his time, he not only saw the invention of sound in cinema, but also the invention of color. And one of Alfred Hitchcock's greatest skills as a filmmaker was his ability to change with the times. Many film historians say that if he had died, for instance, in the late 1920s, his silent film The Lodger would probably put him in the pantheon of greatest filmmakers of all time. It is largely viewed as one of the greatest silent films of his era. And the same is true of his filmography of the 50s and of the 60s. He maintained a prescient role in the conversation every generation that he worked, until the end of his career. As Alfred Hitchcock aged, the film industry began changing again. We were seeing the dawn of the new Hollywood era. And Alfred Hitchcock tried to join in with the changing trends, as he did consistently throughout his career, only this time he was a little too old, a little too out of touch, and he failed. As a result, his late career filmography is largely relegated to a footnote. Movies like Torn Curtain or Family Plot are really nothing to write home about. But there is one movie late in Alfred Hitchcock's career, a movie that he directed long after his prime. And that movie is Frenzy. For the most part, Frenzy's plot is your classic Alfred Hitchcock fanfare. There's a lot of traditional elements that we see present in all of his movies. For instance, there is a man wrongfully accused, there is a plot instigated by coincidence, and there is a serial killer, because Alfred Hitchcock loved serial killers. But unless you're a pretty intense cinephile, or someone who really likes art films, you've most likely never encountered Frenzy. You'd be amazed how few working filmmakers have encountered Frenzy. It's a pretty obscure movie. And the reason for that? Well, Frenzy is a mess. It is one of the most strangely told stories of Alfred Hitchcock's career. There is an entire subplot of the movie in which a police chief struggles to eat meals prepared by his wife that's like played for comedy. The depiction of murder itself oscillates wildly between grisly, confrontational imagery and elegant camera moves. It's a grimy, sleazy, funny, messy movie. That's the word I keep returning to. Messy. And critics of the film would use a different term. Probably something closer to uneven, which is our code word for something went wrong here. But the downside of messiness is that it asks more of its participants. It's the equivalent of an artist dumping a box of Legos on the floor. You have to put them together. You have to get something out of them. But as any fan of Legos would attest, That is the best part. But I'm here today to sing the praises of messy. I'm here today to ask, what is wrong with cluttered art? Our fixation on efficiency and art has largely come from a blending of Silicon Valley logic with our media industries. It started out in Hollywood, but it has grown into the books industry, even into the music industry. You can see practices of efficiency echoed across, for instance, the filmography of Pixar. All of their movies are wound as tight as watches. And this ideology has lent itself a little too comfortably to the games industry. I mean, think of this. We call the people in charge of creating a game its designers. When a game makes an artistic misstep, we call it poor design. That's like criticizing the fenestration on the side of a building. Games aren't architecture. They are a narrative art form. And just like movies or books or TV shows, if they're a little messy, that's okay. Sometimes that's the point. Today on the Video Games Are Bad For You podcast, Frenzy. We're bringing you 3 games that are all messy. Some for better, some for worse. And like all hot messes, they bring as much to the table as they take off it. They ask more of you than you should ever want to give. But I'm here today to say that feeling is elemental to good art. Our episode comes to you today in 3 parts. First, an overview of my favorite and the messiest puppet combo game, just in time for his newest release. Second, I wade through the mess that is Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. And third, we hop in a time machine and we travel back to the inception of Shigeru Miyamoto's strangest video game. Like most puppet combo games, the logline of Feed Me Billy feels like something you'd find on the back of a video nasty. As it goes on the wiki, a flesh-eating hole has appeared in your closet. It's your job to feed it. You must, no matter what the cost. Terrorize the town on your sick quest for meat in this deranged serial killer simulator. And that last part is pretty elemental to Puppet Combo's auteur obsession. His games are all, in their own way, quests for meat. If you're not familiar with Puppet Combo, you should be. While his games have many credits on them, he is largely a solo artist, and an extremely prolific one at that. He has made countless games, and they are all of sort of the same ilk. Puppet Combo games are designed to imitate the early days of PlayStation 3D. They're 3D horror games, usually with tank controls and with limited graphics. His imitation of a PlayStation's look and feel is incredibly spot on, and he takes that imitation and cuts it with the slasher films of the late 80s. There are few better moments in video games than the title screen of a Puppet Combo game. They ooze personality and pastiche. His is my favorite type of postmodernism because at no point does it wink at you. Now, I have not yet gotten a chance to play Puppet Combo's most recent game, Glass Staircase, but I have been paying attention to a lot of its release and release materials. It's a fascinating new direction for him to press into as an artist, because Glass Staircase pulls a little bit more from boarding school giallo stories than it does from American slasher. It may seem like a subtle difference, but take one look at any screen from this game and it is wildly different than his other releases in tone and in feel. And while it does seem to build to a crescendo that's very similar to his previous games, this is a much slower burn than Puppet Combo is known for. His games are usually about punching you in the mouth. But he does have one game with an equally slow burn. And that game is Feed Me Billy. As the logline said, players in Feed Me Billy take the role of a serial killer who has found a strange fleshy hole in his closet that demands to be fed meat. And that meat is human meat. But that's only really the beginning of Feed Me Billy. The game takes place over a few days, and while it doesn't necessarily get weirder as it goes, it does become more fraught with existential dread. It even culminates in a moment where the player encounters what is potentially a doppelganger of themselves. But probably the most interesting idea present in Feed Me Billy is its manufacturing. It's the idea that this was the product of one person's vision. How few games do we have that actually feel that way? And that's why subtle moves like title cards and textures on the wall begin to matter in Puppet Combo games in ways they don't matter in major AAA releases. When you know that this piece was inserted for a reason by the same person who has put this whole thing together, you're able to ask why. You're able to ask why at every turn of Feed Me Billy. And there's nothing funner than doing that with art. When you examine Puppet Combo's fanbase, you can see this sort of latent auteur theory being practiced. For one, his games are extremely popular on stream. And there's reason for that. You know that every step of the way, this was designed by one guy. It's like one person is talking to you. When you watch the streamer respond to a turn in Feed Me Billy, it's like watching someone react to having some off-color comment shouted at them. It's powerful in a way that watching someone play God of War isn't. A lot of times with AAA releases, when you say, well, why is that there? The answer would take a Kotaku article to understand. With Puppet Combo, there are two possibilities. A, because he said so, or B, because he said so. Another interesting thread to pick at with Puppet Combo is how oftentimes the obsessions of an auteur are born of non-auteur products. Puppet Combo pulls influence from an assembly line style filmmaking process of the 80s. Films like Friday the 13th or My Bloody Valentine could be made by literally anybody, and they often were. Many of their most notable signatures are born of mistakes. Not knowing how to operate a camera, not knowing how to stage a scene, not knowing how to act. Or on the other hand, budget limitations. But the reason why Puppet Combo's games are special is that they take these unintentional tropes of the 80s and they execute them with a very specific objective. He's actually doing the same thing with PlayStation 1 era horror games. Things like poor graphic fidelity and tank controls were accidents of the time, and he is now implementing them with intent. And I think that's why Feed Me Billy gets away with having such an unwieldy story. Not only does it have an absurdist premise, but it doesn't really wind down to a satisfying conclusion. But I kind of think that's the point. I think that was Puppet Combo's vision. Not just for this game, but for his whole gameography. He accesses and elicits a fear that the horror movies of the 80s unintentionally captured. A certain fear having to do with a griminess of reality, with the grotesqueness of actual violence. The DIY effect of many 80s horror films served to their benefits in ways the filmmakers could never know. They look like home movies, and home movies feel like portals into someone's head. As such, Feed Me Billy feels like a portal into Puppet Combo's head. And you're not gonna like what he's thinking. You can support the podcast by subscribing or leaving us a rating and review on iTunes. They really make a difference. We also want to hear your thoughts about video games. Disagree with something I've said? Have a take of your own? Fantastic. Shoot us an email. You can reach us at videogamesbadforyou@gmail.com. That's videogamesbadforyou@gmail.com. And once again, our episode is brought to you by BRAINWAVE, our online newsletter. You can receive episodes like this, as well as an exclusive column written by me, to your email inbox every Monday. All right, let's get back to the episode. One quick word. The segment that we're about to do is about Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. So for one, spoilers ahead for the game, although they're not too intense. But I also wanted to talk about the context of this conversation. I've been very disheartened to see that much of the dialogue around Sekiro has centered around its difficulty. Now this isn't exactly new as a fan of a From Software game to see this argument boil back to the surface. And I was expecting it. And to an extent, this conversation has been productive. I've been heartened to see so many people who want to better include individuals with disabilities in playing games. Although I would like to add that accessibility modes are not the same thing as easy modes, and if we're going to call an accessibility mode an easy mode, we're sort of taking 3 steps back for the 1 step forward we'd be taking for people with disabilities. So we do need to be careful about language. The reason I'm disheartened, though, is that I believe From Software is, if not the most, among the most important developers on the planet right now, and Hidetaka Miyazaki is arguably the greatest game designer of his generation. When people like this release content, the conversation should be complex, and it should be diverse and rich, as opposed to being a one-track-minded slog that we could really direct at just about any video game. This game is being used as a placeholder for a broader talk. On top of that, we're seeing both sides of this argument being reduced to cliches. People who support Sekiro's difficulty are being sort of lumped in with the Get Good army. And you don't necessarily need to be a Get Good player in order to think that there is a value to Sekiro's difficulty. But on the other hand, people who oppose Sekiro's difficulty are not all a bunch of snowflakes who don't try hard enough at games. There are reasonable arguments that can be made that Sekiro should have a reduced difficulty mode. And I've seen several of them. But I'm kind of tired of seeing them at this point. And I'd have to guess that you are too. So here's what we're going to do. The following analysis of Sekiro has 0 to do with its difficulty. Many of the things I would praise or criticize about this game have absolutely nothing to do with its challenge. I am by no means a professional player at Sekiro, but I have been moving along perfectly fine in the game, and I have a good sense of its feel and its tone and its challenge. I have felt both the reward of defeating a really difficult boss, and I have felt the frustration of getting stuck. So in other words, I'm agnostic in this conversation, and I want to have a conversation that is agnostic about difficulty, because From Software is such an interesting developer once you see past the challenge in their games, and we're not having that conversation enough right now. This is a much weirder game than we're giving it credit for. If you do want to hear more thoughts about Sekiro and difficulty from me, you can find an article on our website called The Low Cost of High Difficulty. In that article, I try to make a case that Sekiro is not as hard as you think it is, and that difficulty that you're sensing is actually intentional on behalf of From Software, and it has been since the days of Demon's Souls. So give that a read if you're rolling around the difficulty debate in your head, but until then, let's suspend that conversation and just take Sekiro as what it is, a piece of art. As I said at the start of the podcast, the Silicon Valleying of art has really infiltrated game design culture. It's even on the indie scene. For instance, a game like Celeste, which is polished to the point of near soullessness, in my opinion. But From Software games are not polished, and that's actually what makes them kind of fun. You can oftentimes really see the seams in their art. Much of this has to do with their aggressive production cycle. They have produced an astonishing amount of games over the past decade, and once these games are released, people usually find out a bunch of things about their intended design. For instance, Pontiff Sullivan was supposed to be the final boss of Dark Souls 3, and you were supposed to fight him in the Untended Graves. What? We're still data mining Bloodborne and finding cut bosses right and left. It's looking like the Shadows of Yharnam were probably meant to fight you in a completely different area. And that's all ignoring Dark Souls 1, whose late game immolates in front of your very eyes. They simply run out of time too often. There's a likely case that many of Sekiro's most eyebrow-raising decisions are a product of this. A case could be made using circumstantial evidence and what we know about From Software's process that many of Sekiro's weirdest design elements were born of this process. But there's one other key ingredient to the From Software process that we're leaving out. For example, you will never see a more aggressive implementation of asset reuse in any video game. The later phases of Sekiro involve wholesale asset flipping and recycling areas. That reeks of a designer who ran out of time. But we are leaving out one other special ingredient to the cocktail that is Sekiro. And that is its director, Hidetaka Miyazaki. Miyazaki is an experimenting auteur at heart, and he oftentimes seizes on moments in which he's running out of time to experiment. And Sekiro, as it enters its later phases, starts to feel almost like his own private science lab. This is the epitome of frenzy-style game design. Few parts of Sekiro match the others, but they are all so individually compelling that it is hard to take your eyes off the screen and your hands off the controller. Probably the most notable example of this that I can think of is the grappling mechanic. From Software games have always been a little bit vertical, but they have never used vertical stacking as aggressively as they do here. Many From Software fans were reasonably nervous about this new mechanic. And it's safe to say, not only did they crush it, the grappling in this game feels legitimately great, but they also made it weird. For instance, in the fight with Guardian Ape, there are a bunch of trees scattered around the arena, and you can grapple to them and sort of ping-pong around the arena overhead. It doesn't have much to do with the fight. Most people who fight Guardian Ape probably don't even use the grapple mechanic. But it's there if you want it. It's small, weird choices like this that keep rolling around in your mind long after Sekiro is finished. Why did they do that? Why is that there? And that question sometimes comes as a compliment, sometimes as a criticism, and other times ambivalent. I'm ambivalent about the trees around Guardian Ape. That's not a criticism of the game, it's just kind of curious that it's there. On the other hand, I'm less ambivalent about systems like Dragon Rot. In my opinion, other than asset reuse, Dragon Rot is Sekiro's weakest element. I don't think they had time to balance this system properly. It feels like it was different in earlier builds of the game. It feels like it was probably more punishing in earlier builds of the game as well. But when you try to factor in how much you should punish people for losing at the game, you get a undefined number. If Dragon Rot was too aggressive, it would legitimately gatekeep Sekiro. There would only be a handful of people who could beat it. I probably couldn't beat it. I have to die a lot in this game to succeed at it. But on the other hand, by removing the teeth from Dragon Rot and making it only linked really to player side quests, it's a completely false threat. And once you realize that no one is in fact going to die, the pressure it puts on the player completely alleviates. This might be accentuated if we cared more about Sekiro's story, but we don't. Sekiro, unfortunately, has a very, very weak storyline. One good friend of mine described it as Alex Jonesian, and I have to agree with him. So if you're not really invested in the side quests, and you know deep down that you can never really lose the NPCs, Dragon Rot becomes more of a filter over the game, and not a very interesting one. They have somehow taken the interesting but flawed world tendency system of Demon Souls and made it less balanced. We just don't notice its poor balance because it doesn't change the game enough for us to care. On the other hand, there are many messes in Sekiro that I think lean into its best traits. One of them would be possibly the strangest combat system I've ever encountered. The poise system of Sekiro is a delight. It is so cool once you figure it out. And I actually like that From Software avoids teaching it to you because you have to learn what it means. to attack somebody. And it actually gives a deeper sense of consequence to fights than you're used to. As many people have described, the poise system actually creates the sensation that you are in a sword fight because you're not chipping away at somebody, you are more or less waiting for a kill shot. In a real sword fight, it's over once someone gets stabbed. And that's true of Sekiro. But the way From Software has arrived at this combat system is so strange and so convoluted that it necessitates an auteur designer. This is an example of the mess working in our favor. I love Sekiro's combat. It is also very strange. A similar thing can be said of Sekiro's boss fights, many of which are From Software's most creative. Aside from the twist to Guardian Ape, my favorite boss fight is actually a simple one. The Three Monkeys boss fight is one of the cleverest designed things From Software has ever produced, and it is a moment of genuine magic when you uncover it. But it also involves a bunch of strange risks. It's a boss fight that locks players in the arena. Think of that. Also in the frenzy category is Sekiro's weird theming of couples. Not only, obviously, is there the death system, in which you can die and die again, but many characters are echoed across the game. For instance, Sekiro has only one arm, and the sculptor only has one arm. And this actually feeds in a very thematically complicated way into the game's use of asset flipping. Fighting the same boss twice in Sekiro feels oddly thematically appropriate, which is very strange because in almost any other game, this just reeks of poor design. But here it feels almost intentional. At the very least, they baked it into the core philosophies of the game very effectively. And this is why I love messy art, because at a certain point you can no longer decipher mistakes from intentions. And you just gotta roll with it. And that makes the art genuinely unpredictable. But that's the beauty of a messy game. And that's the reason why I will be thinking about Sekiro far longer than I'll be thinking about a game like Dark Souls 3. When all the pieces fit together, there's no question left to ask. But if there's a few pieces missing, the puzzle goes on forever. From the beginning, Yoshi has always been a sort of experiment. While Mario's universe often accommodates all sorts of strange creatures and strange influences, talking dinosaurs were a whole new part of the equation. And in many ways, Yoshi has been Shigeru Miyamoto's darling design. I think when you see his character echoed across the Mario series, you see a level of value emphasized on Yoshi that's not as present with some of the other Mario characters. As such, Yoshi's first appearance feels like a genuine moment of creation, a spark, if you will. But his second appearance feels like something completely different. Since its release, Yoshi's Island has gone down as one of the greatest video games of all time. The rumor goes, and I don't know if there's much veracity to this, Shigeru Miyamoto was a little bit appalled at the development of Donkey Kong Country. He was appalled at the nudging of the video games industry towards a 3D modeling. And he wanted to show how 2D game design could still have its merits. And so when the time came to make a new Mario game, he really dug into his bag of tricks. And he constructed something completely different from the Mario formula, Yoshi's Island. In Mario's Super Nintendo sequel, players actually do not play as Mario. Mario is instead relegated to the object of a game-long escort mission. And this shows how even at its most simplistic, Yoshi's Island is one of the weirdest games I've ever encountered. But there's more to it than that. In the game, taking the form of Yoshi, players are trying to escort baby Mario across an island to safety. If Yoshi gets hit, he drops Mario, and Mario starts bouncing around the screen, crying. And the player has only a set amount of time to catch him. And if the time runs out, you lose. Your health meter is time dependent and fairly easy to replenish. But catching baby Mario is among the most stressful activities you can do in a video game. For instance, there is nothing in Sekiro as anxiety-inducing as some of the later levels of Yoshi's Island. And that's to say nothing of the game's art style, which is designed to look as if it were drawn by hand. Except for when it's not. Yoshi's Island really maximizes a lot of the gimmicks of the Super Nintendo. Probably one of the game's most iconic levels involves the player drinking a bottle of, basically, liquor, and Yoshi becomes drunk. And when Yoshi becomes drunk, the whole world starts to distort and tilt. This level was deceptively taxing on the Super Nintendo's graphics card. Even the game's combat system is tilted and weird. It's built around this idea of lobbing eggs and plotting the trajectory of an arc. It feels closer to playing a golf simulator under duress. But here's the thing, Yoshi's Island is one of the only hot mess video games in which almost every choice it makes works. The gameplay works. The look works. All of its contradictions fit together in this almost magical milieu. The game is delightfully kaleidoscopic. You seldom do the same thing twice. And to this day, its raw inventiveness is inspiring. And it's a reminder to the designers of roguelikes that there are certain things a human can do that a machine simply can't. The voice of Yoshi's Island cannot be emulated. And the game has had a bizarre long tail of influence. Allow me to give you one example. Let's return for a second to the health system of Yoshi's Island. In the game, if you get hit, a countdown meter happens, and you start losing health. If you catch Baby Mario, the meter stops counting down, and you can refill it over time. The effect of this design is a game that is circumstantially stressful. Every encounter of Yoshi's Island has high consequence and high tension, because even the lowest grade encounter could potentially lead to death. But this system also lends the game its speed, because once an interaction is finished, you quickly grab Mario and head on off to the next high-stress encounter. This model was ripped off wholesale by Halo. Halo 1 was designed around a 30 seconds of fun model, where every 30 seconds something of high consequence had to happen on the screen. And Bungie created that model, in part, with a really innovative armor system. In Halo, you have your health bar, but you also have an armor bar. Your health bar is very low, but your armor bar constantly regenerates. So when you get hit, your armor bar depletes, and you can take health damage. As a result, even if you get shot by a grunt in Halo, that encounter starts to have really high consequences. You have to find a way to refill your armor bar. That's the same system, just dressed up in battle armor. And Yoshi's Island's influence has also been felt directly. The series has been going on now for 20 years. The most recent release, Yoshi's Crafted World, is garnering acclaim from critics. But what's fascinating when you look at Yoshi's Crafted World is how all of these experiments from the initial Yoshi's Island have started to become more codified in the Yoshi formula. And I'm not saying that to detract from Crafted World, which has a bunch of really fresh ideas of its own. I'm really saying this because it demonstrates the value of the frenzy game, the value of the messy game. Because it's through messes, video games like Yoshi's Island or Sekiro, or the games of Puppet Combo, that true innovation occurs. These are the nebulas that yield us planetary genres. Innovation does not grow out of slick, polished surfaces. It grows out of something real, something alive. It grows out of something created by someone. And that is the one thing that is true of all three games we talked about today. Love them or hate them, they are the product of an unrestrained creativity. Alright, that does it for us today. Thanks for listening. You can support the podcast by subscribing and leaving us a rating on iTunes. They really make a difference. Once again, if you have any questions, comments, or inquiries, you can reach us at videogamesbadforyou@gmail.com. That's videogamesbadforyou@gmail.com. You can also find us on YouTube and Twitter. Links to both can be found on our website. And once again, this week's episode was brought to you by BRAINWAVE, our weekly newsletter about games and culture. Once again, that's BRAINWAVE, an online newsletter. BRAINWAVE. The games industry is constantly changing. Don't miss a thing. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back here next week with a new episode on a new subject. And don't forget, games are art.